Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill him! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Fredric of the Demonosophy podcast, who is a lifelong student of the occult and esoteric, producing such works as the Airbeth transmissions, Demonosophy, and the Nebu Generator, and his latest book, which Solar and I both read, The Second Awakening and Experiential Exegesis of the Secret of the Golden Flower. Very excellent and very Chinese title. I appreciate that a lot, Paul. And you're also a musician, aside from being an occultist and an alchemist and just sort of big fucking deal in the, left-hand path scene. So I really appreciate it. And it's like pretty rock and roll to have you on. So thank you so much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you. It's rock and roll to be here.
Paul, do you want to say anything about yourself, like about your bio that I missed, or like plug obviously your socials and your book before we start?
Yeah, sure. So Second Awakening, that is the current book. And it really represents kind of a paradigm shift from the line of the other books that you named. It really was kind of a game changer for me. And the book, as the title implies, it's an exegesis of the secret of the golden flower, which is an ancient Chinese Taoist manual for meditation and for awakening primal life force energy that is in each of us. And the reason I wrote this book is because it was in response to an experience that I had. And you kind of touched on some of this in my background. I was born into a Christian sort of cultural context, and at a very early age, I had an inquisitive mind. I had a questioning mind. I had questions about things. I think the same kind of questions every young person has when they grow up in that context and they're presented with Christian ideas like why does God is all powerful. Why does he allow bad things to happen to good people? And, all these basic questions like that. And the sort of answers that I received at that time sort of led me to feel that the people who represented Christianity did not themselves really know what the answers to these questions or the essence of what they were dealing with. And I thought that I was genuinely interested in these questions about what is a soul and things like that. My father died when I was fairly young. I was like 9 years old, and my father died, and I'd been very close to him. So this kind of really set me on this path early on in life of like thinking about these things. So I got into the occult and the left-hand path and Setianism specifically. I spent a lot of time working in that space. And along the way, I picked up lots of different influences and I picked up meditation. And I tried it a couple of times, I think like a lot of people. Um, I tried it once or twice, or I try it, if I'm in a group of people and, they're leading a meditation, I'll go along with it. And then if I was like stressed out or, feeling like I needed, I would go and I would try some meditation, but I was not a regular meditator by any stretch of the imagination. And then what changed, and to fix us in time here, I've skipped over a lot, glossed over a lot, of course, but, around 2019 or so, kind of the cusp of the COVID lockdown era, um, felt this need, and the conditions in my life kind of opened up to this, and I just started meditating every day. I just started doing it every day. I said, I'm just going to do it every day. I'm just going to force myself to do it. And so I found that in doing that, it became, I don't want to say easier, but the things that I think are a struggle for me early on, right? Like, oh, I have an itch. I can't stand still. My mind is distracted. All these things we experience when we try it. I found that by sticking with it and just doing it regularly, like a lot of those initial problems go away and you can get a little bit sooner into that deeper zone. And I also started to find that, the longer I wait during the day to do it, the better a chance something's going to get in the way, right? The day's going to take me. The events of the day are going to take me off into something else. So I increasingly started moving it towards early in the morning. So I got to the point where I was doing it every day. And it was for over a year. Maybe I forgot like how long I was doing it. I wasn't counting anymore. And at a certain point in here, I experienced a change during one of my sessions and kind of into the overall picture of it. I experienced a sort of change that was more substantial than, say, the kind of changes that we get from, an exciting revelation, an intense philosophical discussion, or great experience, or ceremonial magic, or a drug experience, or psychedelic experience. We all have these experiences, and then it's really exciting, and it takes you to the heights, and then it goes away. It doesn't last. Well, this experience that I had, it didn't go away. It just kind of stayed with me, and it was physiological. Changed my, it changed my appetites. It changed my desires. And almost immediately, I had like health problems too going along with this. And I'm not deep dive into all my health problems, but I just like immediately, I just started making these changes to my diet. I no longer had an appetite for huge amounts of rich food. I no longer had an appetite for alcohol. Um, and it was just the changes were so profound that I started saying, what the hell is going on here? And I started thinking about it, and I started, kind of trying to, search online for something. I didn't even really know what I was searching for. And, and I knew, other people in the occult doing, ceremonial magic and stuff, but no one really, had anything. I remembered that a long time ago, I had read this book, Secret of the Golden Flower, and something about it's like, something about it just resonated with me. Like it had the flavor of what I was experiencing. And so I went back and I started reading that book again. And I realized that book is a manual for meditation. And it might sound, you know, if you're familiar with the book, it might sound absurd. The first time I read it, I didn't really get that it was about meditation. I took it as a study of psychology because the common translation of it by Richard Wilhelm has Carl Jung's commentary in it, and I was in college at the time, and so just the mindset is to just take everything very academically and very intellectually, and just like, oh yeah, this is some philosophical intellectual stuff, and I didn't get that. No, this is just really a practical manual for meditation, and it's explaining not only how to go about that, but it's explaining what happens to you. And it was explaining to me the things that I was experiencing. For example, one of the things that the book mentions is that this, the silence and stillness practice be carried out for what they call the 100 days. And then after the 100 days, this change occurs, and the primordial spirit comes to dwell within, and a new body begins to take form. And I thought, well, that 100 days, they don't mean literally 100 days. They're just saying you need to do this until you forget. You do this until you forget how long you've been doing it. In other words, you're not doing it every day, lusting for a result, right? You're not attached to the results of what you're doing. You're just doing it because you're doing it. So that's kind of in a nutshell what the book is about. So I read Secret of the Golden Flower, and from there is where I eventually became inspired to go in and do this exegesis and talk about my experience that led to this. So that's basically what we got there.
Well, I know Solar has a million questions. I'm sorry, Solar. I'm going to go just do one quick one. Paul, a lot of people, and we were talking about this even pre-recording, a lot of people from left-hand path institutional organizations, including Gregory Peters, who we just spoke to, really emphasize this idea of meditation as a means of accomplishment, and maybe not just meditation, but also sort of putting away some of the high magic or ceremonial, I don't want to call high magic, ceremonial magic or practices that go along with it. And I've heard you, I don't want to speak for you, but I've heard you describe something very similar. And this is also my experience. I don't have a ceremonial magic background, but just some of the more ritualized procedures in Western occultism weren't necessarily helpful to achieve the kind of noetic or non-dual or rigpa experiences that I was able to sort of accomplish. And I think all three of us through meditation.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. So the thing about a lot of left-hand path, and again, I'm making a sweeping generalization here, is this word that you find in it that Dr. Flowers talks about, antinomianism, that he talks about in his book, Lords of the Left-Hand Path. And he talks about, there's these qualities of the left-hand path, like initiation, deification, a belief in magic, and that's all well and good, but that doesn't really differentiate it from the other paths, right? It doesn't really differentiate it from how's that different from Daoism, ancient Daoism or Zoroastrianism or these other things. And what makes it different though is antinomianism, that there's this rebelliousness, there's this rejection of mainstream, a rejection of the conventional culture, conventional religion. So one thing about that is when the founding fathers of the left-hand path reject the conventional religions of their time, what they were rejecting was church Christianity, the churchified version of Christianity, the mainstreamified version of religions, not rejecting necessarily what the original teachings were in these religions. And these religions, and I'm just going to I'm just going to pick on Christianity because it's Western, it's a little bit more close to me. The Gospels, Christ is like revealing this teaching that has to do with stillness and silence and watching, and these things like the Holy Spirit comes to dwell and all of this stuff. And he chides, the scribes and Pharisees, right? He criticizes them. You care more about your ritual proceedings, and your laws and your rules. You're in love with that. You're not in love with the higher. You're not in love with divinity. And he criticizes that. But of course, we all know the story. What happened with Christianity? Well, it became a church. It just became a church like all the churches that, he was kicking down the tabernacles for. And, generally speaking, most of these other, what we would call right-hand path religions, well, we're talking about a mainstream, modified for mass consumption. For us in the West, modified for Western consumption, as far as our knowledge, like Daoism, Buddhism, and, things like this, it's all been like Westernized and modified for like the Western palate. So when you talk about the rebelliousness against it, you're talking about rebelliousness, not against the essence of it, against the surface, the personality. And so one of the things that they did, getting back to the original thought here, is that ceremonial, well, we rebel against it. Well, we're going to do ceremonies like them, but we're gonna stamp on we're gonna reverse them all, basically. But they're reversing like a wrong practice from the beginning. You see what I'm saying? It's like because the whole concept of like the ceremonialism was, your individual people, don't worry about trying to do this complex stuff yourself. And we don't want you going home and meditating on it. We're going to take care of everything for you here. You just come sit here and we're going to come up and say a bunch of words and take care of all of you at once, so you all just keep coming to church. So that is all to say, yeah, I kind of came to this experience realizing that ceremonialism, and I'm not saying people shouldn't practice it. I'm not condemning it. There's I've done ceremonialism, and I probably will again at some point. But just that there's this deeper possibility to find something more substantial within us, something more, to unlock something more permanent within us, and getting back to the activity of taking this on as a daily practice, is that when you physically do this, physiologically starts to change you. It changes. Gurdjieff had this great term which he used, called the small muscles. He talks about how the small muscles need to be activated and exercised, and these are the muscles that we don't use in our normal life, day to day, through our day-to-day activities. Those muscles within us atrophy. These aspects of our biology get atrophied. But when we return to stillness regularly, slowing the breath, silence, these things, they start to have an effect. It's not just oh, I realize this, I realize that. My psyche, like I said, wow, no. Our big problem in the West is that the mind is cut off from the rest of the body, right? The mind is kind of floating in its own daydream world and thinks it controls everything. and the emotions are separate, and the physicality is separate. And what we're talking about doing, what something like Secret of the Golden Flower is talking about doing, is getting these aspects of ourselves in alignment, reawakening the intelligence of the body, or awakening the intelligence of the heart, and all of them kind of working together.
I think that's one of the major appeals of sort of sources like the Secret of the Golden Flower and then your exegesis of that text, is you get these really clear signposts, these really clear sort of like markers and descriptions, as you said, of sort of what the types of things that might happen or will happen depending on, that. And so like another sort of set of descriptions that I see as being largely parallel, for instance, in like Dharma, right? It'll say like, okay, so after you have stabilized abiding in the first jhana in a Theravadan context, or after you have sort of stabilized shamatha, you've undergone vipassana, you recognize sort of, you experience the nature of mind non-dually, you enter traksho, then these fetters are going to be either entirely cut off or, greatly diminished and things like that. Really crazy things, right? And I guess if you're a Buddhist monk, you're like, oh, awesome, I know what to expect, and I'm really stoked that these changes, I was ready for this, and they've happened. For us Western people, it can almost be overwhelming, because you're like, what the fuck is happening? Like, where did those drives go? Where did those appetites go? Like, you might even have to be like, okay, well, how do I integrate this into like a marriage? Or, things like really weird stuff. But the point is that you have this kind of textual tradition and these lineages that can explain a lot of these things really clearly, not just how to get there, but like, you won't be guessing once you sort of start to experience these things. I do want to ask a question before we move on, because you also mentioned as like maybe not an essential, but often presented as sort of an essential feature of the left-hand path is self-initiation. And I wanted to ask you really directly about either the Golden Flower specifically, or if you want to sort of broaden that out to Neidan, Taoist internal alchemy generally, and the use of that and potential limitations for that tradition or those traditions as a vehicle for initiation in the West. So you don't know me, but I'm primarily a Dzogchen guy. But I also do have a little bit of a background, as much as I've been able to establish in Neidan through Dragon's Gate lineage, which is its own kind of complicated thing. And to the best of my knowledge, I think there are like 2 teachers who have been authorized to teach online in English, right? And there's Nathan Brine and then like some other guy. But the point is, right, it's extremely limited. Right, you're much more likely to be able to find like a Dharma center, find some Tibetans or people doing Vajrayana Buddhism, right? And I was just kind of wondering, like, it almost seems like there's maybe a certain personality type that's going to be drawn towards an initiatic path that is like particularly hard to actualize in a kind of social way that necessitates more self-reliance. And it just kind of struck me that like you had gravitated, with your sort of history, that you had maybe gravitated towards a gate that is a little more challenging than most, because like if you have a question, if you encounter like roadblocks, you kind of have to figure it out yourself, not totally, but more so than, a Vajra bro or someone else. I don't know what your experience has been in that way.
Well, I think the term, let's talk about the term initiation. The way term is used mostly in the West, it means you're initiated by someone else, right? It involves someone else initiating you into something. And of course, from a left-hand path perspective, they say that they say self-initiation, and it's really radically different. I think Gurdjieff, also the only other person that I'm aware of, had used this term specifically as a self reflexive thing. So that being said, any kind of well, I don't want to say any kind of school because my experience is limited. I know people in Dzogchen, but I've never been involved with that, so I don't really know how the nuts and bolts of how that works as society. But as far as like things that have degree systems in them, there's always there's always this something about the experience that brings it back and reattaches you to other people within the organization, within the initiatory system, within the degree system of it. And that was something that I found I've gone through that kind of thing in the past. Really, when I kind of had this experience was when I just kind of, this was one of the things I no longer had an appetite for. You might say there's just something about it, for me, Blaze, that I realized that it was feeding this part of myself that was just made up. Or you say the ego, the thing about the ego. I mean, you can say, left-hand path people like Anton LaVey is like all about, no, that's all about the ego. You want to have a healthy ego. Feed that ego, give it what it wants, treat it well, be nice to people, but give your ego whatever it wants. But the problem is that you come to the realization that the ego is just made up. Then what is the aim of life to just feed something that's made up, right? It's a fiction. So
It's certainly not going to help take you there. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Let me give you, just before so you move on, because I'm curious. I assume your answer will not just be helpful to me, but perhaps like a lot of people in similar situations who are maybe engaging with your material directly or similar material. So for a while, I was having, during what we would call like maybe peak meditative experiences or something like that. Basically, when the cool stuff was happening, let's just say really generally, as like a side effect or something that I thought was an intrinsic part of the experience, was absolutely insane, like heart rate and stuff like that, like 180 beats per minute, type of like cardiac stress, as things were, also kind of like popping off, right? And I thought that was really cool because again, oh man, this, it's happening. But then, kind of stepping back, you're like, that's a potentially kind of physiologically treacherous situation. Like I'm a young guy, like fit dude. But even for someone like me, you don't want to be like kind of pushing physical boundaries like that necessarily, especially if it turns out that's not like an intrinsic part, a necessary part of what's happening.
Yeah.
And I found that I was able to avail myself of like, again, just turning to like a group chat or people, senior practitioners who had maybe gone through like similar, experiences as to what I was kind of testing the boundaries of. And they were able to answer some of these questions like, hey, these could be, issues in practice. Here's some like supplementary things, supplementary practices that you can maybe do to work on that stuff, to stabilize that, give the energy somewhere to go, whatever. Right. And something like that, was again, I was grateful for that. And part of that was the benefit of having, something, working in a tradition that was maybe a little bit more like just accessible in social terms as a Westerner. Right. And since I would assume that you working, with the Secret of the Golden Flower, like you haven't had as much access to other people who have walked this road and can give you that really direct advice that's from direct experience, how you've navigated, maybe not a challenge exactly like that, but just like practical, speed bumps like in your practice and how you've had to creatively solve those problems working on a more solitary vehicle.
Sure. So, I do have a group that I practice meditation with, a Gurdjieffian oriented group that I practice meditation with. So I do have I guess a resource of, elders, to reach out, to have these kinds of, talk about what I'm going through. And, another thing I wanted to say is that I think when you start doing this kind of stuff, one of the first things you're doing is you're challenging your body's understanding relaxation, what relaxation is and what tension is and where that's at in the body. And so I'll find that changed for me, and it continues to. That's something that's just a continual refinement. Every time I return to stillness, I can always return and find there's like new tension somewhere. And I know, when you mention your experience of feeling extreme tension and extreme excitation, I've had that experience where I'm like, oh wow, I'm really like work here, my heart's racing. For me, the effort is always to return back to stillness, return back to slowing. And we realize that like not all of my body, in order to meditate, not actually all of my body really can't be totally relaxed. I actually need some tension, right? Like I need some tension to keep my spine erect, or keep my head in a proper position, I don't need, my arms flexing and these other things like going on. So there's always like sort of this constant returning to that. This is like part of the development of attention, which is another one of the really main things that's going on with this whole practice. Is we're learning to have attention in a different way. We're learning how to experience a different quality of attention than we're used to. We're taking, normally our attention is always directed outwardly. And it's being dragged around by this and that, attached to things. It's identified with things. Everything in the world, everyone we know is competing for our attention, to have our attention, to consume our attention. And when we do something like meditation, we're saying no, and we're returning the attention around and we're turning it inside. So we're watching the breath. We're looking for we're looking for tension inside. We're attempting to relax. And there's something about, and they say watchfulness all the time in the Gospels, that this watchfulness, this is in the Golden Flower too, that when something is watched, the tendency is that it becomes calm, right? It's like it knows. It's like the body, the heart, you start watching the heart and looking, it's like it knows it's being watched. And what happens when you're being watched is it just calms it down. Just the seeing of it calms it down. So we're always making this effort to return to seeing ourselves, to try and see ourselves as we really are, to not see, the made up image of ourselves, but what we really are inside. Are we still on?
I apologize. I muted myself. I did so Solar.
I had a feeling.
Okay.
I was trying to make space.
I apologize. I muted myself so Solar could see that I wasn't gonna jump in, so he could ask his questions. I apologize for that. So, but Paul, you said something really interesting that you again referenced. So I'm glad you did, about Christianity, because this is something that Solar and I have discussed many times, and just in general. I do not take an adversarial position against Christianity, even though I'm not personally a Christian. And I don't, I call it we have called it generally the outer temple, inner temple, and secret temple sort of framework. You call it church Christianity, which I also appreciate, because that's exactly the same thing. We're just referring to the same thing. I think that there is exactly like you just dropped a video on it, like a sort of pre-institutional sort of, we'll call it Aeon of the Sun framework that that exists before the church. And I wondered if you would speak a little bit on that. I've heard you speak on it before, but I just think that it's interesting because a lot of people from the left-hand path do tend to take not just left-hand path, but occultism. I'm not a pagan, but like a lot of pagans also take like a very adversarial, a very like denigrating position against that. And there is, I think that if you have had noetic experiences, it's unquestionable that there are Rosicrucian elements or like sort of like a hidden symbolic language of signs and symbols within Christianity itself. But exactly like you said, it's very, very difficult, almost impossible for someone in the outer temple, the outer presentation of that to sort of access those practices because they're just not, it's just that rituals become empty and meaningless. And so any teachings associated with it are also going to sort of degrade in quality.
Yeah. I want to say where Christianity went wrong, but that's like so big. And there's so much other stuff. But just, one thing is like there's a faction in the West that says it's all literal. The Bible is all to be taken literally. And if you even try and say, oh, well, maybe this story means that, or this story means no, it's literally, this is what happens. And this is why, I mean, this ends up getting woven into to politics and all this other stuff. But I mean, I feel like when you go back to the source, you can see that this is like, this is clearly not how it was intended that this stuff be taken. So you encounter a lot of what are called parables, like Christ speaks in parables, and one of his students asked him, why do you always speak in parables? And what that means, that term means, is that this can be taken literally, but there's also this other meaning that's higher. But if you're not ready to receive what's higher because you're not in the right state for it yet, then you can take the literal meaning, just take the story. You can just take that and remember that. And then maybe later, when you've gone through some experience that kind of changes you, you're more open to this higher meaning, then and it will be available to you, or you will be available to it. I think Solar touched on this with the idea that that some of these ideas, like you're given like a book, you're given like this manual, say, of all these things that are supposed to happen when you go through this. And you might be there and you might not. You might not be ready for it. It might not make any sense for you because you can't really receive. There's certain ideas you can't receive them and been prepared for it. Right. And there's actually lots of parables also in the Gospels about being prepared that has to do with the soil and stuff like that. But going back to the idea of what was the term you used? Solar cult or something like that.
It's Aeon of the Sun is how I think I phrased.
Aeon of the Sun. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that. Aeon of the Sun. So there's different words for, many people have had different words for this. That universalism, sometimes they say universalism, that there was like one teaching before it got like broken up into different things. And that's why we see the different fragments of it. Recently, I read a translation of the Bhagavad Gita by a guy named Ravi Ravindra, which I really like, but he talks about the term Sanatan Dharma in there. which is, for many, this is the insider word for Hinduism. But he defines this word, he translates it eternal order. That this is reference what goes back in the Vedic text, what goes back, to like, prior to, Zarathustra's and this idea that there's an eternal order. And I think that's just such a beautiful way of expressing. I see that definitely within the Egyptians, that all of Egyptian society was based on this idea that there is this eternal order. It is intended that we're part of it. We have a unique function within this order. We have a special role to play within this order. The sun is a great symbol for this, or quite literally, represents the next, higher level, one of the next higher levels in universal hierarchy, a cosmic hierarchy that we find ourselves existing in. And I mean, you find these influences going out into other things too. Like, I mean, the Bible, all the great prophets in the Bible, they came from Egypt, right? Like, Abraham is he's from Samaria, or Persia, but, is Joseph goes to, Jacob's son Joseph goes to Egypt, and he stays there. He loves it there, and he marries into it. And
Yeah, they all sojourn in Mitzrayim, right? I think we just passed it for those following along the Torah cycle, right? Abraham just left Egypt a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. From Abraham to Plato, it seems to be this sort of running theme, right? There's this sort of concentration of gnosis, running, sort of erupting out of Egypt. Yeah.
Right. Plato went there. Pythagoras, I think, went to Babylon. But I mean, the Babylonians, that's the thing, the Persians and the Egyptians, there's clearly this huge crossover of ideas going on in there somewhere. And then the Secret of the Golden Flower comes in here too, because Secret of the Golden Flower references the scarab, talks about the scarab beetle, specifically the scarab beetle and the dung ball represents the creation of a new body, the astral body, or the Kestion body, or the subtle body. And maybe that's from the Silk Road. That's from something earlier. There's other, I heard there's other like ancient Chinese artifacts they found that look like this Zoroastrian presence. So, yeah, I mean, you go back far enough, there's some kind of huge cultural exchange. And certainly, I think all of them have this idea of creating, awakening this other force, this life force. The Greeks call it the daimon. The Zoroastrians call it the Fabashi. Christ even calls it the paraclete in the Gospels. The paraclete, which is a word no one talks about, but he actually talks about this other consciousness, watcher perspective, silent witness that arises within us. Aleister Crowley called it the holy guardian angel, and I think a lot of people in Western occultism are going to be familiar with it by that term. But it's really one of the oldest ideas, and the pathway to finding it is almost universally silence and stillness practice that we withdraw from chaos, the activity of life, right? And I don't mean to frame all of life as like chaos, but life, I mean, there's a purpose for it. There's a reason why we're in this material world now, and we have a material existence, and we have a spiritual aspect that's also it, but it's not of the earth, right? It's like we have material within us that is of the cosmos, but also part of us is made with the material from below. And there's a reason for that, why the rubber has to meet the road here for some reason. We have to do this mixing of the higher and the lower, to get this inner alchemy, Nidan, this inner alchemical process in order to give birth, an inner birth, to a new embryonic form, which is this second body. And that's called that. So in the Bhagavad Gita actually uses that terminology as second body, at least in, some translations of the second body, just like, Secret of the Golden Flower, all these other ancient sources.
I'm really happy when I was reading through your book. I was really happy to see the sort of fairly prominent place of like Christian references in there, just to call attention to the fact that these subcurrents, these traditions do exist, even if they're kind of buried beneath many centuries of sort of accretion and bureaucracy and all the stuff that you've kind of already talked about. I also appreciate, though, as kind of I think it's really easy to kind of get lost in the sauce of operating at a purely theoretical level, right? Like trying to, uncover the sort of the primordial tradition. Do I look at Egypt or go into the Vedas and Sanatana Dharma and this and that? And I'm not knocking any of those things, of course, but when it's purely an intellectual exercise, when it's an exercise in sort of like, ideation archaeology, right? You can kind of go anywhere with that. And something that's so clear in your book is like, hey, the way forward with this, or really like the principal way to discover the sort of like potential of a given school of thought, a technique, anything, is practical experience, right? Does this system provide me with a clear way forward? And like, again, ways to measure my progress, and ultimately, like, can it take me there? And again, that's not like something that you're going to think about. It's something that you're going to discover by doing, and in that sense, like, that gives us then a really helpful way to evaluate different traditions. Like, as you were talking, when you first mentioned the sort of like Christian currents, I went over to my shelf and got an Orthodox prayer rope that I happen to have, so I'm kind of twiddling that on my thumb.
Cool.
And definitely with hesychasm and stuff like that, there are still these live traditions, like within particularly Eastern Orthodox Christianity and in Catholicism as well. But at this point, they're largely confined to like monastic contexts, right? And if you walk into a parish and ask about hesychasm, your priest will probably say, "Whoa, slow down," spend 5 or 10 years just being a normal guy. You can invite demons in if you don't, if you don't have the right setup, right? They're gonna slow walk you. Whereas if you walk into, the International Sanatana Dharma Society or a Tibetan, Dharma center, they'll get you started on a mala. They'll get you into these practices right away. As obviously, if someone picks up your book, okay, here's how to get going, right? And it's sort of like, how much clutter is there? How much, sort of like stuff is there in the way that's going to prevent you from getting started and then making clear objective evaluations of your progress in the practice to see if you're doing something that's worthwhile or not,
No, right on. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned hesychasm, and that's another thing I value very highly is Philokalia, the teachings of the Desert Fathers, and this is one of those things that, after my perspective had kind of changed on things, I started reading some of that. Well, they're clearly talking about silence and stillness practice here, and when they talk about demons and devils, they're talking about all of the challenges that come along with that, all the things that sneak in to try and steal your attention, right? There's all the different things that can steal your attention and take over your appetites, take over your desire. And I'm like, wow, this is all a very useful system, and it's I'm always so a little bit disappointed when, like you said, someone from the Orthodox Church, oh no, don't meditate now. That could be dangerous. You could be letting in demons. And Carl Jung does this. Carl Jung did this too in the in his commentary for Secret of the Golden Flower. He actually recommends against meditation, like a good solid academician. This could be dangerous for the Western man. And I think that the only thing that's dangerous is that people don't stick with it, right? I mean, I think people can unlock something and then get really excited about an experience that they had, and then just go and then get overexcited about that maybe. But I mean, just there's nothing fundamentally dangerous about just sitting still, I mean, for crying out loud. It's something that no one ever does. It's the last thing anyone wants to do. But to just sit still, it's probably the only time that you're not doing anything that might fuck shit up in some way or have some kind of repercussions. It's probably the only really totally safe, unconsequential thing that you can actually do. So I think people should not be afraid to do it for whatever reasons.
And also too, sorry, I know I have a feeling Jin muted himself again, but I just, as a quick thing.
No, I'm letting you have your moment.
You're so generous, man. I appreciate that. Something that you emphasize that also now makes sense to me, however many years on in my own practice, that's emphasized in both Dzogchen and like Zen Buddhism, is the awakening experience, the recognizing the nature of mind, however that is going to be sort of framed in those different traditions. But I happen to think that we're talking about the same thing. That's not the end of the road. That's the first, that looks like the peak, because from the position of ground level, you can only look up and you can't see past that. But in reality, that's like the necessary sort of precursor experience that actually starts the sort of lifelong, potentially more than one lifetime, but
Right.
that starts the lifelong sort of continuing transformation, right?
Yeah.
And so in a certain way, even though you can't force that experience, you can't just like bear down and sort of force your fire to arise necessarily. It doesn't really work like that. But in a certain sense, like there is a degree of urgency there, right? Like you do, and I know like, again, you kind of emphasize this. I've heard like Rinzai Zen practitioners really, it's like you are in a way kind of trying to hurry the student along to that sort of breakthrough experience so that you can get to the real work, which may not be as like overwhelmingly exciting. It may not have like the character of the breakthrough, the stereotypical sort of enlightenment moment as it's kind of memed in the West, but that's actually the start. And you really need to get that sort of motor going. I don't know. It's an important sort of like reconfiguration of the sort of from the traditional like Western kind of New Age or whatever conception of like a spiritual journey. The thing that's posited as the end is actually just like step one. But you can't skip over it. You can't bullshit and pretend you have or think, oh, maybe I did it, and then keep going. You can't ceremonial magic your way around that.
Yeah.
It's absolutely foundational.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you need to even move in that direction. You have to have the fire. You have to have a wish for it. You have to have a really powerful wish. And in a gospel sense, this is hope, right? When you talk faith, hope, and love, these three, and hope is like that is like this wish for something, but a wish not for some kind of thing, right? So a lot of people find their way into occultism and ceremonial magic because they want stuff. They want to change things, right? They want to change things in their life, and there needs to be a deeper kind of wish that kind of arises within the organism for something higher, and it still has a question about it, that it doesn't even know really what it's exactly wishing for, but just this wish for something higher, or something real. And and maybe that term need fire is relevant to this. But because you find that, I mean, yeah, you can use magic and energy of the emotions to like change things, or make it seem as though you've changed things. And people always just want the same stuff. They want romance with someone, or they want a new job, or they want a bunch of money, or something, or they want recognition for this or that. It's always the same things. And I mean, what you find eventually is that anything that you could gain that way, maybe you could have gained it by conventional means, but even if you gain it, however you gain, it's going to be gone eventually. You're going to lose that. Or eventually things are going to change. You're going to worry about it anymore. So it's all transient, and it's all like just the desires and the wishes that come from the ego, that come from the made up part of ourselves, the part that's like we've just accumulated over a lifetime. It's been programmed into us. And so that is not permanent. So how is something made up going to decide that you need this, or, I need this, or I need, and it's like legit, because it's all serving some made up feature within us. So something higher has to kick in, something deeper within us, that has this wish and has this yearning, I think, to find the fire to really settle down, to the kind of to develop the kind of inner attention that's needed. And you're right that even like gaining something from that is not like the end all be all. There's just like a sort of there's a significant change when the ego is not leading anymore, and you don't get rid of that, because we need the ego, we need our personality, we need to interact with the world around us. I still need to be able to go to Starbucks and get a venti americano. Sorry, I brain freeze. I'm trying to think what do I order at Starbucks. But we need the ego to be able to continue this interaction. But we just want to change things to where the ego's not leading us all the time. It's like get thee behind me, right?
Well, it's also really fun when you really start to understand these things as like masks that you put on. When you understand, like, not only is this like not me in some sort of fundamental ontological way, right? Like that's really obvious, but then you can sort of decide with a degree of intention, and even like creativity, like how do I want to sort of like live into the world, right? Like how, and yeah, it's a completely different relationship, and again, I'm not saying that I'm some transcendent person, but you start to experience the world, your relationality to other people, into sort of some sort of objectives, or however you want to say that, in this totally different way, without this like this rigid identification with those things. And yeah, it's very cool. It's very great.
And that kind of touches on what I think of with Dharma, that our ego and the faces that we wear are kind of determined for us in our life, right? Our family and our soulmates, and the sense of like personal responsibility that we have to fulfill our dharma, right? Our path in life. We don't just, if we're making up masks just for the heck of it, and we're creating personalities to accomplish things or to disrupt things, that can take us in this other path. But we need like these other masks in order to do something to get through life effectively. And I'm thinking of this in the Bhagavad Gita. There's like a segment where Arjuna is like asking Krishna about something along these lines, and he's no, you have to like do what you came into this world for. You have to still take actions. You don't need to like just become a monk and not interact with society anymore. You still need to fulfill your obligations to society, but just not be attached to them, right? You just need to divorce yourself from your attachment to it. And that's really where that work in life aspect comes. What does that even mean to not be attached to something? I want something to happen, I'm working a job. I'm making hamburgers. I want to make good hamburgers. I want people to like the hamburgers. So I want to do a good job, but I also want to be not attached to it. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I am, going to experience a certain kind of inner struggle as I go through this process.
Thank you so much, Paul and Solar, of course. I think I want to go back a little bit to something that both of you brought up, which was the nature of Christianity. Now, it is interesting and not something I often speak about, but the Kala Chakra Tantra does refer to Christianity and all Abrahamic faiths except for Islam, of course, which is in a different category, as being a tamasic path, a tamasic marga, meaning that it is passive in its, at least the way a tantric would look at it, even in the esoterica, even in the deeper sort of layers as they would understand it. And it is important to note, like something that Paul brought up, like there was Zoroastrian churches up till like the 9th, 10th century in Western China, just as there was Manichaean churches up till the 16th century, just as there was Syrian Orthodox churches. So it's not like there was no cultural interchange or like even the sort of transmission of ideas. You can even find references to Jesus in certain Taoist texts, especially in like Xinjiang, which people might know from the news, or in like other places. So, and then you have the Thomasine Christians, of course, in southern India, who say they've been there since, St. Thomas supposedly sailed and converted a bunch of people. So what my point is about that is that I agree that there are maybe deeper layers that weren't articulated or weren't well known, but I also think that just from a tantric perspective, if we're going textually, it's lacking something. It's lacking that rajasic impulsive action that we would value as tantrics, like exactly what Paul's saying, like an engagement with not just the sort of spiritual forces of the world, but also like bringing, maybe marrying it in a non-dual way to actually the way you live your life.
So I titled the book Second Awakening, because we get what we need. We get our first awakening from nature. Like nature provides us with that, we awaken to the world when we're born on a daily basis. And to me, the idea that then there's this possibility of a second awakening, and it happens on other levels. There's a second awakening of your life. There's a second awakening. There's gonna be a second awakening of the day, and so on. And there's other words for this, like like Bhagavad Gita says a second birth. So it's all over in the Gospels. There's talks about man is in a sleeping state, or he was dead and he was reborn. I personally think that a lot of the story about Christ's crucifixion and then arising this is actually a story about the astral body, or return of the astral body. It's even kind of described like that at one time in there. And that's another way of looking at it. And there's also, there's a couple of people that get raised from the dead, and these could actually be like, that's the, for the parable aspect of it, that's the rock of it. I say there's the rock in the water of the parable, and the rock is the part that, can only be taken literally, right? And so the rock part of it is like, oh yeah, well, no, he's raising people from the dead. That's like some serious mojo. He must be a son of God. And the water aspect of this is that, well, he helped this person to awaken from sleep, or from death, right? And so, and I hesitate, in Christianity, there's like the idea of they say born again, but that means something else, I think, in that. So I hesitate to get too much into the rebirth metaphor as it is in Christianity, because I want to, conflate any of that. The idea that there is a qualitative experience, and it really begins with seeing yourself a state of sleep, that you are in a state of sleep most of the time, most of the day, you are in a mechanical sleep state most of the time. I think that you have to really start to see that, and see that all of your, even though you're out, you're doing all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of projects going on, and producing all of this stuff, that so much of it is just reactions to things that are going on around you. And seeing yourself in this sort of mechanical state, that's the beginning of developing that sort of wish for something that is qualitatively different, for a higher quality of attention, and a higher quality of being, and to not be led, but to be able to have something within me which can lead.
Well, I like this, Paul. And I appreciate that you're trying not to conflate rebirth in the Christian sort of context of it. But because obviously my handle is Wukong Reborn, I'm a Buddhist, so it makes sense for me. And also, I know you have a particular, we'll say, affinity for Hanuman. Whether you think it's the same or not, we can have a discussion about that. But I just think it's an interesting sort of framework, and I appreciate that when you've talked about your awakening experiences through meditation, or through this Neidan or Dantian sort of inner fire practices, that you've described something that I recognize, even though I don't necessarily do it in like a Taoist way, or like drawing from Gurdjieff or any of that. It's I can recognize what it is. I don't know if you have any comment or thoughts on that.
So, gosh, two things. All right, there's two things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Hanuman, and then I want to talk about the story of Christ at a well. When he goes to a well, I think it's the Sumerian woman at the well. And she offers him some water at the well, and he tells her that water, you can drink that, but you're going to be thirsty again really soon. If you drink the water from my Father, the living water, you will never thirst again. And there's this, so the rock literal part of this parable says, this is Christ he's kind to Sumerian woman offering her water. They're supposed to be enemies because of some tribal, Hebrew tribal thing. And that's the significance of this story. I think the significance of the story is when he talks about living water, he's talking about the awakening of something within us that is material, fluidic, possibly even, that does connects us with this higher aspect of being and this higher possibility. Jump over to Hanuman here. What's cool about him and in relation to this, and you can say this for a lot of people, for a lot of avatars and the Vedic system, that, he's, Shiva, he's an avatar of Shiva. And when Shiva, he decided to incarnate as a monkey because he wanted to help Vishnu. He knew Vishnu was going to reincarnate as Rama. He wanted to help him, but he didn't want to embarrass him by say, "Oh, you need help down there fighting demons," right? So he reincarnate. He's reborn, goes through a rebirth as Hanuman, and Hanuman is like he's cursed so that he doesn't remember who he is. He forgets who he is. So he's not really aware of a God. Whereas Ram has like a better awareness of this. But this idea of being rebirthed like that is so all through. It's just so all in the Eastern, within the Eastern system, the mythology of it. And I think that is just such a great aspect of it. And also that it gets you into the habit of seeing the divine in all things, right? Like, the thing that's always confusing to me about Christianity when I was younger was that they'd say, "Oh, well, God is like everywhere." But not everything. No, not everything is a man. No, if anything you think is a manifestation of divine. No, it's not mentioned in the Bible. So no. And it just seems like then they try and restrict this idea so much. And that's one thing that I find very, very nice about Vedic and going into the Eastern system is that it gets you in the habit of seeing that the divine is everywhere. Yes, there's one source for it, right? It all comes from one source. There's like a primal cause of it. I do think that is in there. I tend to think that is in there, but the divine is in all, and we're all going through this rebirthing process.
It's funny. It's that language and that concept. And again, I'm glad you mentioned the parable of the well, because it's right there in the Western esoteric tradition as well. People who've listened to the show for a while, they'll know I started off as an Evola guy. I spent a year trying to perform Negredo and Albedo, the sort of alchemical operations that were outlined in his alchemy book, right? And so, again, trace the language of that story that Jesus tells to that woman, right? And then think about the process of dissolving the body, the ego, the ashes of Saturn in the alchemical Mercury, and what arises from that, right? In the Albedo phase of the operation, it's the spirit, it is the life, right? It's right? And then we have to bring that back, recognize it, identify what it is, et cetera, right? So it's like these things are all right there, like all of these traditions are really pointing it, not just like very similar ideas, but even like when we get down to the level of procedure, like if we have the right sort of framework to interpret these things, we can kind of see that we're looking at similar like technical operations, in all these paths.
The problem that we have is the mind, is the brain, the intellect. It's like it could be our greatest enemy, and the problem is we always take new knowledge, we always take it in the old way. We always take, and fit it into a box of our previous experience. And this is what I did with Secret of the Golden Flower when I first read it when I was in my 20s. I just put it, I was like, oh yeah, I understand this. Yeah, I get it. And that, you're talking earlier about, right, the different systems, right? There's correspondences between all these systems, and And the dangers that the mind loves this, the ego loves this. The ego loves, I know all these systems. This means this means that. And the mind can just get stuck there, for me anyhow, my mind got stuck there, just, having fun with these things. And it's like, then when I realized that, then when you do like start to kind of bring it down and real sensation in the body, then you have an opening. Then these ideas that have just been kind of sitting up there, these patterns, that have been kind of sitting up there. It's like now they have they're the seeds, and now they have some real soil that they can wash down into, and actually grow into something. Because it's all supposed to, all the ideas are just supposed to grow into something else. It's supposed to help, just sort of coagulate, if you know what I mean.
Appreciate all of both of what both of you said. I feel a little called out simply because I do tend to think of myself as a mythologist, and I like putting together, I think as you do too, Paul, like these sort of symbolic trees or languages, maps of like the symbols and signs of the, primordial or perennial system. I'm not a perennialist, but people recognize that word. I think you're right. And I think that, mind is obviously the fundamental sort of like component of reality, and like all of our cliches and skandhas and klipas and all the bullshit that we, aggregate and also arise with. Yeah, we have to clear that. And obviously the cosmological layer can be a hindrance, can be a fetter to sort of like reaching that diamond thunder or Rigpa. I 100% agree with that. But it is fun. It is fun to try and map as much as you can.
Oh, it's real fun. It's real fun. So while we're talking about correspondences then, Jen, I want to ask you, what is your take on Wukong and Hanuman? Is there a connection?
There is absolutely a connection. Now, there's a camp of scholars who believe that they are mostly one-to-one, maybe not quite one-to-one, but in relative degrees of each other. I take the second camp, which is the story is obviously mixed from the Ramayana through the transmission of Southeast Asia. So my family's from, I'm sorry, Solar, because he knows all this already. He's heard it a million times, but my family's from the diaspora, but they're originally from Indonesia, Chinese Indonesian. So the Ramayana is a big deal. It still plays a big role in sort of the Indonesian, you could say, mythological landscape. And there is a theory that sort of the Chinese traders in the 13th century, led by the pirate Zhang He, who also went to South Africa, also went to Australia, that they picked up Indonesian or whatever ethnicity they were, sailors in Jakarta and Sumatra, or not Jakarta, Java and Sumatra, and they brought them back to China. So this was it doesn't necessarily even have to be a maritime route, because obviously the Tantric Buddhism and Tantric Hinduism that was practiced in Laos, Cambodia, Burma, all of this, the Ramayana is sort of a central story. So you can see that it kind of leads into a specific province in China, which is Sichuan. So Sichuan originally had what's called a white ape cult. So this was
there's a white Hanuman too.
That's right. So the Monkey King, he is related to Hanuman, but it might be a later edition, is what I'm trying to say, in a not very articulate way. And I think that I do think that there are parallels, but I think that there's an independent character from Sichuan, but it just might be a Chinese version that sort of lost its connection, because obviously the Himalayas sort of form a natural land barrier, and it's obviously deep jungle and it's hard to traverse. So the maritime or Southeast Asian route, I think, is most plausible, and so that would have been a later introduction, a reintroduction. So I actually think that's kind of interesting. And Sichuan is also a place where there was a lot of tantra, a lot of, especially like we were just talking about like dakinis and yoginis like a few hours ago. And yeah, this is a place where a lot of ethnic Tibetans also live. So I think that it's totally possible that it's like a kind of reformulation of a character that is very important. And also to go back to something you said, Paul, like as an avatar of Shiva, if we accept that, I personally accept that as a tantric. I agree with that. Now, some people will say he's really an avatar of Vishnu or like the multi-headed Vishnu. I can accept that too, because, you know, we have to be flexible in like our frameworks. Like what you believe doesn't mean I have to believe it, but I can accept that. But in tantric Hindu, or not tantric Hinduism, tantric Buddhism, especially Newari Buddhism, Hanuman becomes a Bhairava. So he becomes directly an emanation of Mahakala. So the ferocious sort of nighttime god consciousness, the waking consciousness, we would say, of the Lord of Time. So there's a direct relationship there. And in Chinese Mahayana Buddhism, the Monkey King, so not specifically Hanuman, but the Monkey King, he is a Dharma protector, a worldly Dharmapala, but Dharmapala, like a Buddhist nonetheless, a Buddhist figure. And also in Daoism, he's obviously the god of circus performers and day laborers. And specifically, he's worshipped by Hokkien and Cantonese diaspora. So it's very important sort of for these like sort of I'm sure you're aware of it, Paul, but there's like a whole practice of like mediumship and spiritualist sort of practices, just like the Golden Flower book, just like the planchette writing. This is a big part of sort of like the Chinese, especially like Chinese Mahayana Buddhism. So so there's a whole like spirit medium called devoted to the Monkey King, and he is invoked particularly for exorcistic means, like to beat demons. So very similar to the Journey to the West story, of course, which is also considered in Chinese Mahayana Buddhism as a sutra. So that might surprise people that because it's a popular sort of quote unquote folk tale or even one of the 4 great novels of China, but it is actually a sutra text if you understand it in that way. So, and even in the modern incarnations of that story, there's a famous Chinese comic called Westward. The Monkey King actually dies in the story, like in the first 10 comics, the first 10 series. So, but then he's reborn. He's actually reincarnated into a different body and a different sort of character personage. He's given a different name. He has different powers, but he slowly comes to re-recognize and re-become not the same figure, but sort of a higher apotheosized, higher consciousness, maybe a Buddhist consciousness version of his old trickster self. So all that being said, I think he is a perennial Buddhist character. I think he's a Taoist character as well, but I think that maybe a nexus point between those two things. I think that you can relate him to Hanuman. I don't think that the sort of like Buddhist and Taoist conception of the Monkey King is the same as like how the Indians view Hanuman as more of a devotional figure, subservient in a way to Vishnu.
Right.
But I do, he's subject, like in the Chinese story, obviously, he's subjugated by the Tara or the Guanyin, Avalokitesvara, depending on how you understand who she is. And so he plays a role in like, he's not bhakti. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. He's not a bhakti character. He's subjugated, but even in his subjugation, it's not because he's evil. It's because he tends to overthrow hierarchies in heaven. So very much what you were talking about at the very beginning, like being having like a rebellious impulse against like certain static forces. Like he is that. He overturns the tables of heaven. He overturns the marriage ceremony of the Jade Emperor. Like he pisses on a statue of the Buddha. I mean, he's a bad boy. And so, but it's not the Buddha himself who even subjugates him. It's like this feminine divine force. And so I think it's a slightly different version, or maybe a more cultural contextual version, or a more Buddhist version. But I think there's a relationship. I know that was a long, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, that's great. So then, but then doesn't he also, Wukong like helps, he experiences like service because he also helps, by the way, of helping them, you know, his his friends, the pig and the other guy take these Buddhist scrolls to the West.
Well, that's the whole fundamental parable, is that you can understand this story as being just a normie literary story, like just a parable, folk parable, or like an opera story, Cantonese opera. But you can also understand it in that Buddhist or Dharmic layer. And so what text is he going to India to get? Well, in some versions of the story, he's getting a Pranaparamita Sutra. So if you understand it from a tantric perspective, the Pranaparamita Sutras are the origin, the flower, and they're often called a flower text. They originate the tantras because you can derive tantric mantras from Pranaparamita Sutras. And you can also understand it as him retrieving tantras. And so depending on, I guess, your view or your skill level, you'd understand him as serving that exactly what you said, like a function of like a demonic world order.
That's so interesting. So I think of like, Hanuman, when he's a baby, he tries to eat this and causes this total chaos moment in the universe. And that's why he gets like cursed by Rudra or something, so he doesn't remember himself. But he does that reminds me kind of like the Monkey King tries to overthrow the Jade Emperor, or he tries to jump over the Buddha's hand.
Yes, this is a big part of it. And that even in and of itself, the Buddha's hand, that metaphor, it's not just his hand. The Buddha's performing the gesture, the mudra of boon giving. So he rejects the Buddha's boon. That's sort of the metaphor of that story. So it's really interesting that you brought it in.
Hanuman is like totally into this service Dharma thing, totally in service to Ram, but Ram, is also Vishnu and Vishnu and Shiva. They're also just faces of God eventually. And so they're all the same thing. And there's this great statement from Hanuman where Ram asks him, how do you know me? And he says, when I forget who I am, I serve you. When I remember who I am, I'm you. Which to me is the statement of when my normal state, I forget who I am. So I just follow, the egoistic signs that I left for myself of doing the right thing, right? But when I have a moment of awakening and really remembering who I am, in that moment, I'm part of it all, right? I ascend for a moment there, and part of it all, part of the absolute and everything. But then at the same time, in the Ramayana, Hanuman's a very violent, very bloody, kills like just millions of demons, and it just totally has this unbounded rage element at the same time. And the reason I think this is I like talking about this is over the last couple of years I've talked to more people in India who live in India, and I found that some people are very, very oh no, it's not the same. They want to keep it separate. Some people don't, they want to say, Hanuman is totally different than Wukong. And then there's a lot of people who consider it are all about the literal interpretation of it. That, oh no, everything that happened in the Ramayana, that absolutely happened. Mm-hmm. And I find that so interesting.
No, it's absolutely interesting. And you brought up something else that I didn't respond to, but I wanted to, is that him bringing the text to the West. Well, this is a secondary story that appeared in the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century, is him returning the text. but he actually brings them to Persia. So it even goes along with what we brought up at the very beginning about this sort of Zoroastrian connection in the Shi Wangmu, who is the queen mother of the Jade Pools, queen mother of the West, who is like in Mahayana Buddhism, Chinese, obviously they call her Jin. So she is the Pranaparamita Sutra. She is the actual sutras herself. She appears as this grandmother in heaven who, I think her job is to take care of the peaches of immortality and the dakinis. That's where she lives. Like she lives on a mountain, and all the fox goddesses and the dakinis live around her. And she's kind of like the grandmother or the mother of them. And so he has to kind of bring the text back to her to sort of fulfill the cycle. So there's something very samsaric about the whole story, and in how he is kind of an anti-hero, but he's also like a heavenly hero, but he's not really on the side of heaven, because if you read the secondary story, which I'm forgetting the name of, I apologize, but he is actually sort of at war with the gods, sort of like, to bring back what you said, Dr. Flowers spoke of. Like he's sort of he's in rebellion. Of the heavens, because the gods actually want to use, the devas at least, want to use his texts, this magical Pranaparamita Sutra or Tantra, which also appears as a goddess or a girl. They want to use that for themselves. They want her essence. And so this is also something really interesting, is that when you even read the original story, Journey to the West, his role is to protect Tang San San. So he's to protect the priest. The priest is a male in the story, but it's often depicted as a female in media, because if you understand, it's really Vajrasattva. It's really like the pure diamond purity king, the Bodhisattva of like extreme purity. And the white horse is the dragon, is actually a dragon. It's actually like the dragon of chaos, and who's been subjugated and reborn himself to serve also this function, as is Pigsy, as is Sandy. So all of them are on this journey. But if you understand the sort of end, like how the story ends, Sandy and Pigsy actually are destined for lower rebirth, because they are never able to overcome their sins. Pigsy has the sin of lust. Sandy has the sin of wrath. They're never able to overcome it. But the three others, Monkey, Tang San San, and the white dragon horse, they actually are destined for higher rebirth. So it's kind of interesting that they sort of posit all of these, like this amalgam, this like RPG gang, you could say JRPG gang, and like, but they don't all end up at the same conclusion. So like what Solar was bringing up about the Black Brother.
No, that's really interesting, especially about the rebirth aspect, that they're destined for lower rebirths because, well, that's what they still care about. That's where their attention still is. Their attention is on things of the earth. And so, wherever your attention is, that's where you are. That's where you're going to be. It reminds me in Dante's Inferno, when he goes through and he sees people in hell that are like suffering that he knew. They always ask him, they don't ask him, hey, do you know how I get out of here? They always ask him, how are things back on Earth? How are things back in Florence? Is so-and-so, are they still doing this? So they're still attached to all of the lusts and stuff, basically got them there. So it's like they're there because that's where their retention is the meaning of it. And how do I change? This is the question. How do I change my desires? It seems impossible, right? When we look at our desires and our lusts and our appetites and how they lead us through life, it's like, wow, how do I change that? And it's like we struggle with it forever. And so that's where it's like trying to find this like a higher sense of attention into something higher that can like transform me is something that arises for me, like arises as a struggle against that,
That brings up something interesting. Sorry to kind of jump in. You guys can hear me, right?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. So because there's this anxiety, maybe from Western perspective, especially when you're reading about this process of sort of like either shedding or burning up the ego and sort of trying to sort of relax into and ultimately merge with this higher self. But you're like, okay, but if it's not my conceptual mind, and it's not my sort of ego, it's not my heart, it's not my groin, like what's left? What's going to be going on, right? Like, am I just going to be a zombie, or like what the hell is this, right? There's this something that you state more clearly than I've encountered it in a lot of other texts, and again, something that kind of resonates with me experientially, is that at the end of the day, this isn't something that you really have to worry about in a sort of intellectual way, and certainly not like ahead of time, because it's actually something that, again, just as the process kind of unfolds, as you just kind of just rest more and more in awareness, these things tend to kind of straighten themselves out. Like, you don't really have to worry about like where the boundary of like true will is, or what you know what your the impulses that sort of arise out of dharmakāya are going to be. Like, things just kind of happen. It's a lot less sort of stressful, and you don't these sort of like conceptual knots are exactly that, right? They're not actually they're not real knots in terms of how things actually
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
unfold. It's important to like point that out, just so you don't get so wrapped up that you're afraid or confused or otherwise unwilling to actually like even try to embark on the process.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. We can create all kinds of like problems. The mind creates problems. The mind takes information that we get and it takes everything in the old way. Gurdjieff had this great word, the formatory apparatus. And this refers to the aspect of the mind that's basically like a file clerk. That's what a lot of what the mind does, the brain does. It just files away stuff and into what category you've decided everything needs to like go in. So a lot of the times when you see that there's a problem, like you said, is there what is the limit of free will? Is there an edge to free will? What happens to my sense of self and consciousness? Will that get absorbed into the cosmic soup, and will I lose myself and consciousness if I go that far? And the thing is that a lot of that is really just ego, right? It's just the made up part of ourselves, and we spend our whole life thinking that that is our real self, right? We think that when I say I, I'm referring to, Paul Fredric, who, was born here and was in a band and works this job, believes this and has read these books and blah, 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 and all the things I've done in life, right? And those are really that's just the stuff that I've acquired for the most part. It's not necessarily my essence. So some people like to use this terminology that your essence is what you come into the world with, and your personality, the ego, is everything that you acquire while you're here, either by indoctrination or imagination or for whatever reason. But our essence is what we really come into the world with. And the more you see how much of your ego and personality is made up, then you kind of lose somewhat. For me, anyhow, I kind of lost like that fear of, oh, I'm gonna like lose myself, because I don't really know what myself is. The brain doesn't really know what a self is. And one of the things that a lot of us have a deficiency in is our capacity to feel. Our character armor and stuff like really cuts off a lot of our feeling. I don't mean so much emotions. When people talk about emotions, it's in the direction of emotions, not just simple love, fear, and anger, right? But that we have feeling, which is a function of this center that we have. I'd say it's like the middle dantian, right? The solar plexus, somewhere in that region. in this, collection of nerve nodes that we call the solar plexus, is the ability to feel things. And since we've kind of had this schism in our being, those parts of us are separated. The other thing I don't think I've really talked about much yet, which I think comes in here, is the idea of mankind being in a fallen state, or Gurdjieff says a sleep state, or a state of hypnosis. And it's a theme in these other texts. This is why they talk about awakening, because man is asleep. And most of these, most of the super texts do allude to this. There was a time in history when things weren't like that. We did get, organic beings, human beings did get what they needed through natural existence to just grow up wise and not completely fucked up and full of all kinds of dysfunction. That we used to be normal, we used to be functional, but something happened and now we're not. And so there's mythology about that. It was a Garden of Eden, or some reason, the gods were displeased, and something happened, and so nature only takes us to a certain point now. To go beyond that, we need something else. We need to make some kind of super efforts, or we need access to a higher kind of knowledge or something like that. And that's where this idea of an esoteric search, initiatory search, comes in to play.
I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, Paul, but do you think that we are fallen? Do you think that we are maybe we just take it in the Gurdjieff way. I'm not that familiar with Gurdjieff's work, although I will say, something Solar I spoke about pre-recording was a lot of people who were affiliated with TOS have a deep interest in both Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And it's been referenced every time that I've spoken to anyone, even remotely peripheral. Toby Chapel, Dr. Flowers, it always comes up, even when I don't bring it up. So, which is fine. It's just that I'm not that familiar. Even Greg Kaminsky, he's a big Gurdjieff guy. I don't know that much about it. I still don't, even 2 years later. So that says something about me. But I just wonder, what is your perspective on it, and in your opinion, is your work a way to rectify that?
To rectify
sort of our fallen or sleep state.
Yeah. So Ouspensky talks about something they call the prison allegory, which runs something like this. If a man realizes that he is in prison, and what could he hope for but to escape, if he's rational, if he's a rational person? So we have to be rational first before everything, and that's the basis of so much of Western and Eastern civilization, really. That we have to be able to be reasonable to a certain extent. If we realize that we're in a prison, the only rational thing that you can hope for is to escape. And then you realize that to escape, you can't do it entirely by yourself, that you need help, right? You need to find others who also wish to escape, because you have to make plans and stuff like that. And so you realize the first thing you need to do is find others who want to escape. And this kind of goes back to Plato's cave allegory. Basically says the same thing, the state of man. And this might be the basis for this fallen state idea. That man is basically, we don't see reality clearly. We don't see reality properly. Buddha says this too. We can't see reality properly. We see it upside down. We see it subjectively. We see it false. And we need to do something. We need to go through some kind of efforts to be able to see reality clearly, objectively. And that's where the idea of any kind of like way like comes in. And you know, I think Lao Tzu like makes references to this as well too. You know, it's like the Tao can be told is not the real Tao. It's like the minute I start talking about it, there's already a degradation. It's already a degradation because I'm turning it into my subjective language. Everyone who hears me is going to understand it in their own subjective way. And so you realize the terror of the situation. No one can really communicate with each other. No one can really be objective about anything that we hear. So that's kind of our situation. I mean, I think the film The Matrix, is a good example of this. When that film came out, everyone was like, "Oh, this is great. This is totally illustrating these esoteric ideas," and it really is. But it's not that you look outside of it in reality. You know, it's not just that we're in a computerized reality. It's like the reality of reality, whatever it is set up in this certain way. Our role in it is set up so that we can't see it all for what it is. Dr. Aquino had recommended one of Ouspensky's books, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. And so I think because of this became popular with, very popular within TLS. And many people read that book. But that book is like it's like the most distilled like version of this huge body of work that goes back to, you know, Gurdjieff was born like in the near the Caucasus Mountains, not far from Mount Ararat. His father was a bard, like a shock in Armenian society. He was Greek and Armenian, and so he was a storyteller. And so there's all this collected wisdom in that area of the world at the time is like where like East meets West. And so it's Eastern ideas, Western ideas, Orthodox desert father type stuff. There's, influences, the dervish influences, the Sufi influences, all of this kind of stuff in there. So it's not surprising then that the ideas that Gurdjieff brought partake of all these different things and have ramifications in all these different systems. But much of it comes back to this silence and stillness practice and this practice of self-observation.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, just because you sort of mentioned Gurdjieff in the context of temples, and I'm also not particularly familiar with Gurdjieff. I was, I had it thrown at me in interaction with Setians, right? Like, hey, read Man's Possible Evolution, kind of go from there. And also, I'll admit, I had listened to your podcast a little bit, but really, I was fairly unfamiliar with the esoteric order of Beelzebub and some other things like that until sort of after the fact. Like, oh wow, this guy just kind of left. Sort of picking up the pieces retrospectively, trying to get a sense of what the hell is going on after things seem to have kind of shaken out. But I was just kind of wondering how you, from your present vantage point, not just having partly left this temple, but also too like having kind of embarked on this very serious, not just study, but really implementing the practices of the Golden Flower as you described in this book, which is now a couple of years old, or it has been released for a couple of years. Just kind of like if how you would presently contextualize the sort of work of the esoteric order of Beelzebub and that kind of like Gurdjieffian kind of thread through your practice over time from the
Yeah, no,
if that makes sense.
that's a great question. So for a long time, you referenced this. I was trying to like kind of like integrate them, and you've seen that like that. A lot of this happens in TOS. There's a lot of integration of like these other ideas, come into it. Other systems come into it. It's almost kind of a clearinghouse for all these systems. And I had worked with the Gurdjieff stuff for a while, and to the extent of like these other things that aren't in all these books, like doing there's this whole series of like movements and sacred dances and stuff that go along with that. There's this body of music that goes along with it, all these other aspects of it, and eventually I found that, well, not just that, but it's all kind of wrapped up in this experience that my personal experience, but that all of that was just really was incompatible with a degree system kind of structure, not so much with like the core foundational ideas in Setianism, which they were always encoded in book The Coming Forth by Night and the Diabolicon, and things like that. But there's the degree system, which always ends up sort of keeping us connected with other people and what other people are doing. There's just this connection with that eventually I just found was like incompatible, with the direction that I was going. But I mean, I can totally see. I mean, it was something that for me for a long time was like very, very useful. Was very, very helpful at a certain stage. So I don't mean to say that it's not helpful for anyone or that anyone shouldn't look into it. But I just came to a point where it was no longer productive for me to continue with it, if that makes sense.
Totally. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, I have a question a little bit about Aeonic politics. I don't know if this is a good place for it. Jin, are you cool with that?
Of course, go for it.
Cool, yeah. Yeah, so I think, and obviously this will not be a surprise to any longtime listeners of Demi-Gods, right? But for people who maybe aren't familiar with your sort of extended body work, you will quickly discover, or people will quickly discover, that you have sort of consistently articulated a very direct and explicit relationship between the sort of fundamental tenets of left-hand path initiation, these concepts of self-sovereignty, of will, of agency, of differentiation and individuation, right? And tying that not necessarily to like, red versus blue politics, but ideas about, again, will, sovereignty, property, right? And there's right. And I don't want to say like you backed off from these things, but this was a very, very prominent feature of a lot of work for a long time. And it's something that struck me, even if I didn't necessarily come in with exactly the same friars. It was like, this is again, clear and concise sort of formulation of political thinking in Aeonic terms, directly like mapping these things like from the principles of initiation in the left-hand path to practice, at least in an ideal sense. Yeah. And I was wondering if any of those things have maybe changed over time for you as you've kind of pursued your sort of present trajectory, or if those things still feel as invigorated and yeah, no,
definitely. As I learned about the left-hand path and discovered it, and that was like in the 80s, and it was 1990 it came into TOS. And I saw Dr. Flowers give His first lecture on the Seal of Runa, and brought out Lords of the Left-Hand Path. And I got a signed manuscript copy from him before it was published generally. Everything that he says in there, I mean, I still feel it's all very, very comparable with ideas like personal sovereignty, liberty, freedom of speech, private property, all of these sorts of things. I think it's totally consistent with that. That's how I understood it. Anton got very clear about a lot of these things in some of his later writings. So a lot of that was like my emphasis in the podcast when I first started out. Let me go back a little bit. Let me reminisce for a little bit here. So the first episodes I did, I just posted like a lecture, I think, that I had given. I put up a couple of lectures that I had recorded. And then I decided, I saw that there was so much coming up on social media and different areas in the world where people were using this term left-hand path to conflate it with left-wing politics. And a lot of this was the TST, the influence of the TST, which is just a social justice protest group, which I won't go into. If you listened to my podcast a while ago, I'm sure you've heard me rant about it enough. But I felt this need to like kind of stand up for like what I understood like the LHP was, which it was a legit, as you know, so a very legitimate system of self-initiation and self-inquiry. And two things have changed. Oh, and so then what I was going to say is that I did a podcast episode where I just like talked about these things, right? I defended capitalism, oh my God. That's like the worst thing you could do, worst thing you could say. And then I shared it with Dr. Aquino, and he said he loved it, and he was just publishing his new book, which was the Satanic Bible Revision, 25th anniversary Satanic Bible Revision. So then I interviewed him, and that's basically that's how I look at the baptism of the Demonosophy podcast. That's the fire that it all came out from. And you're right, I don't emphasize those things as much in recent days for a couple of reasons. One being what I mentioned earlier in this conversation about, I kind of realized that a lot of the left-hand path was that antinomian was directed against a mirage of what they perceived organized religions to be. And so in some cases saw that as, a mirage against a mirage. And so there's that. And the other thing is that just the sheer weight of people who just want to conflate that term, the LHP, with left-wing politics is just there's just so much of it that I don't know if it's really doing any good to get into it, because it's just kind of this argument that goes back and forth, and people who see it who feel that way, and people who don't feel that way don't. And I don't know if there's anything to change it, but to address kind of the larger question about politics in general, because I try not to be political, and I consider the sphere of politics to just be a part of the ugly realm of delusion that we must suffer through. But I try to focus more on economics and economic questions, which are part of the materiality of our existence that really directly affect us. And so my ideas on those subjects will come out more in terms of, John Locke, Austrian economics, life, liberty, property, things like that. And I'm talking about values, right? I'm talking about values here. I don't know what is the best thing to do about it other than to stand up for my values and try and defend the values and try to connect with other people who share those values. If that makes sense.
I really appreciate that perspective, and I guess like I'm glad I sort of found your work. And again, this is not I'm not even trying to like link myself to you. I don't want people to associate if they're familiar with some of my output to think that's what Paul also thinks or anything like that. But just thinking in terms of like what ways of conceiving of the self and the sort of the self's relation to other people and the world around oneself is sort of conducive to initiation, right? And that can be in the economic sphere, that could be in the political sphere, everything, right? And the sort of like totality of our, say, sort of like karmic attachments or entanglements to people around us, historical context, things like that. Anyway, I just think you were sort of articulating a sort of important perspective, and definitely what amounted to a really, really valuable, I would even say essential counterweight to the prevailing sort of trends that you just kind of described. Anyway, and again, similar, not one-to-one, but similar ideas have come up a lot in sort of some of our conversations in our little groups. Talked about, Junger's conception of the anarch, right, as articulated in like Humisville, among other places. Conceptions like that, the Abelian idea of the differentiated man in the sort of Iron Age, like what that implies, right? Anyway, just I also would like to see a broader range of perspectives reflected, maybe in the discourse a little bit. Things maybe have swung very, very heavily toward one side, at the expense of sort of independent thought, and again, thought that I think nurtures, fosters a sort of drive towards the transcendent, towards individual initiation. So anyway, I've appreciated where you've been coming from historically, I guess.
Well, I appreciate that. So another thought that occurred to me is Murray Rothbard, who's one of the greats in Austrian economics. He wrote a great book called "What Has Government Done with Our Money?" And one of the things that he said is Lao Tzu should be considered the first libertarian. So the thing is like these ideas about sovereignty, personal property are not ideas that were made up in like the 1800s. No, this is the part of the original ideas of the original wise people. So another thing that I've talked about a little bit on the podcast, and I'm actually planning on doing another episode on this shortly, is about the Egyptian goddess Ma'at, which is kind of gets in a canned form in popular Egyptology of like a goddess of justice, is actually this really ancient principle of cosmic order and harmony. And again, I'd say it's Sanatan Dharma. It goes back to this idea of the eternal order. And one of the things in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that happens is, and first of all, there's like different, everyone got their own Egyptian Book of the Dead. And in ancient Egypt, there's not like just one book that, is for everybody. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead that we do have, the main one was one written for a specific person from that time period. But all of them have this one part of it where they have to declare, it's like the 42 declarations of Ma'at that the soul has to make before the scales of Ma'at, before they can, have their heart weighed and get into the afterlife, or else get, torn up by demons or whatever. But these 42 declarations are all things like, I have not stolen another man's property. I have not killed another person. I have not spoken ill against anyone. They all represent these values that we've just been talking about. They all represent values of individual personal sovereignty, private property, free speech. All these things are represented in there, and so maybe this is kind of where I'm going with these ideas now, is that these ideas are much more ancient. The idea that we had to rebel against the church to be able to come out and like say these ideas. It's like, no, they're the ones who rebelled. They're the ones who went against the ancient teachings, all of the organized religions. They're the ones who fucked it up and took it in an evil direction that has just created more ignorance and more misunderstanding and more violence in the world, right? More regulation of individuals' private wealth has occurred with these organizations, and they get in bed with government. So it's like, it goes back before this. And Dr. Flowers, he touches on this in Lords of the Left-Hand Path. And I talked to him about it. I've done a couple of interviews with him. I know you guys have too. But, you start to see when you're reading through that book that all these ancient systems, well, Daoism was really left-hand path. Well, he doesn't call it left. He just refers to it as a way, right? So what is the function of us using that term in this day and age? And does it have meaning against a right-hand path? Do we always have to be, because if I'm married to the left-hand path, then also, well, I have to always make sure the right-hand path is wrong. Or
right. Yeah. In some ways, you're sort of enslaving yourself by the need to define yourself against this other thing that is outside your control, right? So you're in a way, you're imposing limitations, contingencies on yourself by maintaining this dichotomy, for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
Just to drive home to for folks who might not be like as familiar with it. So for a few hundred years, right, Taoists had fairly consistent positions as like political advisors in China when there was like during periods of relative stability, right? But as periodically happens in the history of Chinese civilization, things eventually sort of went to shit, and descended into just really, really turbulent periods, warring states, etc. And essentially the court Taoist philosophers sort of lost their positions of influence, power, and even just like livelihood, right? And so a lot of them, this tradition kind of evolved from one that had been proximal to power, right? Able to exert some influence directly or indirectly in power politics and just onto the world. It evolved from that into this sort of hermetic Taoism, right? They became sort of mountain sages and things like that. And I think this is the reason I mention this here is because it can be hard, I think, in the present when we feel potentially like we're powerless. There's things out in the world that we wish we could change, whether it's injustice or nonsensical politics, things. We get wrapped up in these externalities, these things that are so much bigger than us, and it can feel overwhelming. And those preoccupations, I think, it can very easily come to sort of dominate our thoughts and can essentially like bog down what should be the focus of our process of inner alchemy, inner transformation. And so looking at the sort of Taoist pivot from court advisors to hermits and other, kind of ways of practice, it can, I think, provide us some really crucial reference points and models for how to maintain sovereignty of the self, how to maintain a sort of focus on the sort of microcosmic world that we can control and that ultimately really matters over and against the macrocosmic forces, which threaten to overwhelm us if our attention falters and we sort of get lost in the sauce, right? They had to sort of navigate that in a really sort of high stakes cultural situation in order to survive. And I personally find a lot of like inspiration from learning from that period specifically,
No, that's a great point. And so I was thinking of the Gospels again. So, I mean, that's another thing that happens in there. I mean, one way you could take this whole story is that the state crushes the soul of man, literally. And it's a problem. But at the same time, he says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So we exist with it, right? We have to find a way of like existing with it, but to work on something else within us, kind of in secret, you know?
It ultimately kind of comes back to, at least in very general terms, kind of a tantric idea, right? It's this thing that, again, it threatens to crush us, to overwhelm us. But in reality, if we can find a way to take that difficulty onto the path, right, and use that as a spur and a sort of like catalyst for our initiation, it can actually be like finding a way to sort of finesse and negotiate that point of exchange, that point of interface, that power differential between self and state or self and other. Like that can be a very that can be a point of radical positive initiatic transformation if we can find a way to engage with it productively. But if we can't, it might fuck us, you know? I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
That was really great, Solar. I agree with you, and I agree with what Paul said. And I've always come to I didn't have like a libertarian orientation. I'm not even a libertarian per se, but I just want to use a sort of word to encapsulate like what we're generally talking about, maybe the contour of it. And but the deeper got into my like tantric or my meditation practices, I agree with what Paul's saying. And like there is a kind of like truth to all of this. There is a kind of truth to self-sovereignty. There is a it's deeper than relative truth. And so, and this is true for a lot of tantric masters. And like, you can even make like a Buddhist parallel to the, like the Xian or the, you know, the, as Solar said, like the mountain sages, like the, as the Taoists later became. It's also interesting that a lot of the Taoist poets initially were bureaucrats who had retired from public service and lived off their pension and were like sort of wealthy, sort of aristocrats, I guess, but like they would kind of retire to the country and like translate the I Ching and write their letters to each other, love poems often. Very interesting. And but I just think that there is a sort of like a truth about like self-liberation. And like if you're walking down that marga or that path, then there are sort of conditions that you have to meet in and of yourself, like whatever the self is, but like in the engagement with the world. And Paul, I think you'd find it really interesting that there's a very famous Canadian, he's forgotten about now. Nobody remembers who he is, but like old people like me. But his name is George Woodcock, and he wrote a kind of definitive biography of Louis Riel, who was a rebel, in fact, against the crown in the 1880s. But he also wrote a book called Anarchism, A History of Libertarian Ideas, and he includes several Taoists into into like that compilation of series. And it's a really excellent book. And I'll cop to it. I stole mine from the library, so because I kept checking it out, and I just really wanted it, so you know, had to have it. But don't do that. But I just think that a lot of what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And there is a kind of like the anarch, like the Junger's anarch, like Solar brought up, and there is something that I see that is like truth. I don't really know how to even articulate it or describe it. Solar's the you know, politics, metapolitics, like guy. I'm not. That's not my world, but I do see it, and I struggle to sort of articulate it as well as you do, Paul, or as well as you do, Solar. But I have to say that I agree. And I think that it's provable, and I think it's testable through wisdom science.
Yeah.
This is me
No,
kidding.
you know, another thing that I think relates to this is, and this has survived more in the East. I think this is in the Bhagavad Gita. The idea of being a good householder, as an name, the model of the good householder, and the idea is that comes back to personal responsibility, that you have to be, you can't be dependent, right, on someone else to be able to go and do this work. And so that's why you see like the model in the East is that someone, you know, they raise their family, they're a good householder, they raise their family, then they retire, then they go off into the forest and spend, you know, and meditate, you know, all the time. And the idea is that it's because you have to be responsible for yourself. You can't be a dependent on someone else or on the state, say, for instance. So for me, that's like where this idea of personal responsibility, sovereignty, where that like comes into play as in a spiritual sense, right? It's a value. There's an economic value to it, but there's also a spiritual reason for it. Because whenever if you're dependent on someone else, then you're completely like attached and you know, always beholden to that, always coming back to that, and subject to being like manipulated and moved by your dependencies, if that makes sense.
I think too, there's this really direct relationship, right? Like, just in practical terms, the liberation is often framed like in a dharmic context as this sort of like freedom from contingency, right? So you're sort of like stripping away anything that could be subject to change, degradation, et cetera, right? In pursuit of something that is super personal, that is absolute, right? Whatever that is, just in really, really schematic terms, right? But and certainly in our age, like we don't just get immediate contact, you know, with that. So I think for a lot of us, our first contact with freedom is going to be the very banal, mundane, and relative sense of like freedom in our daily life, right? Like whether that's like economic freedom, personal freedom, right? We get a little bit of taste of what it means to be like masters of our own lives and our own destiny, right? To be able to make meaningful choices, just in like, you know, kind of bullshit everyday, you know, life path kind of stuff, right? And we get that feeling of, I want to, you know, I want to be more in control, and I want to sort of, you know, take this as far as I can go. I think that's a very natural on-ramp to the spiritual path, right? Or seeking out that higher level of spiritual self-initiation and development. And so I think it's very, very insidious the way that our like contemporary society essentially is doing its best to make us all sort of mutually dependent on state, dependent on these kind of like overlapping systems that are larger than any individuals, you know, massive sort of like corporate entities, and all these ways. It really limits our serenity, our natural sort of instinct, or our fine tuning that would otherwise point toward freedom and give us that like initial taste that then that at least some people will choose to pursue it in greater and greater measure. It's like we're being suffocated. Like that impulse, that little bit of a taste is being snuffed out before it can really take root and develop into something that goes beyond the mundane and, you know, just sort of super personal. I think that's a real shame, and it's a real danger, and something that we certainly need to be aware of, and, you know, if possible, perhaps, you know, do our best to resist various capacities.
Yeah, no, that's a big question, and I go back and forth on this. All right, is this actually the worst time in history to be alive, or is it the best time? Have there been worse times? And it's so hard to say. It's so hard to say that, but I think there's always been a struggle. Like we were talking earlier about our fallen state. Maybe there was this time when there wasn't a struggle very, very early on, which no one really remembers except through mythology, vague collective unconscious memories and shadows. But there's always been this perceived threat to it. So, you know, there's Zoroastrianism, you know, looks at like, I'm going to remind you that there's this force that there's a force of evil and ignorance and degradation and density in the universe. Inertia, like it's a force of inertia, that is opposed to the principle of creation, principle of consciousness and conscience, and that there's a struggle between these two things, and that has to do with why human beings are in the universe, why there's this creature, which is like part of this is like kind of like an animal, but then we seem to have this other part of us that's not an animal, that seems to want to look up towards something higher, that we came from somewhere higher. And that we're part of the reason that we're here is to like help in this struggle against that by us going through this process of transforming substances within us, because this is what we end up doing, is we go through a process of inner alchemy, not a process of thinking about inner alchemy and thinking about alchemical ideas and thinking about, oh, they used to think lead into gold. No, but like Nidan, right? We like actually go through this process of inner alchemy, combining substances, bringing in and extracting finer substances from air, from the sun, things like that, that transforms things. And we maybe get this experience ourselves from this, we gain something from this, but it also is possibly has another function, which has to do with the cosmic balance and the inertia and preventing that inertia from just taking over everything.
Well, my last thing, Paul, I don't know if you and Solar conspired against me, but you did bring up the Aeonic, and I just want to say, well, Solar often teases me that I'm a rebirth, a frat, or a chod, but I don't know if that's true. I like to think it is, but it's more of a joke or a bit. But I agree with everything you're saying. I think that we are like sort of the aeons of the cosmic struggle, like in and of ourselves, like our consciousness, we embody that. And obviously we live in a cycle, whether you want to call that samsara or something else, that's fine. But I do agree with everything you said. I think that we are in a struggle against the archons. Of course, the archons arise firstly in your own mind, maybe primarily, maybe only. But
Yeah.
obviously there are these like structures, you could call it like the tunnels or the, the klipas or the body of the Babylon. There are structures that are like against like the sovereignty or the sort of like a higher consciousness of man. And so I do think it is kind of a primordial or perennial, perhaps, a struggle against them. And like, I think we're in a great time, Paul. I think we're in the Aeon of the Daughter, and I think we're, ready to fucking rock and roll. That's what I think.
I do too. You convinced me.
Well, I mean, you brought up Mach, so it's like I don't use that exact same framework. Like wouldn't use the Egyptian framework. I'd use a tantric sort of explanation, but it's so similar, and it speaks to like this idea of exactly like what both of you were speaking of, like sort of pragmatism, freedom, but with sort of like discriminating awareness and bodhicitta. And I think that there's also like a thing that you mentioned, Paul, about personal responsibility, but then I like to bring in this idea of indigenous ontology and like responsibility treating, maybe you could say, with the land that we arise on, because I personally, this is just a Jin thing perhaps, but I personally think that to be, well, this is an idea of Dharma as well, so it's maybe not just from me, but there's an idea that, where you are reborn, if we believe in rebirth, obviously I do, it actually is sort of, there's a karmic implication to where we are born. And I think that being on sort of a new world or a free world island, you could say, I think that is a great gift, in fact. And I think that where your consciousness arises is actually who you are, more fundamentally than race, more fundamentally than any of the other sort of like externalities. or even internalities, maybe even deeper than metaphysics, like that we would understand it. And I think that our responsibility then is to like where we are and to like the people that are around us that are also here. And so when we sort of become, we are in a stage of becoming of higher consciousness, those implications of sort of karmic bonds, they actually increase because our awareness of them increases. I don't know. You don't have to agree with me, Paul, but that's kind of the Aeonic framework that I use. I think we have to use our psionic powers to sort of like break the klipas, break ourselves out of the tunnels. And I think it's totally possible. That's just me, but I do think it is.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. One really beautiful thing I'll just mention about being alive at this time is that we can sit around and have this conversation about so many different religions and initiatory systems and mythologies. And I mean, if we were like born like 100 years ago, we'd maybe know about two, you know? If we were born like, 500 years ago, maybe you just know like one. But we live in a time period where we can access the fruits of all of these other teachings and ideas and utilize them for our benefit. We can find other people so much easier than we used to be. And at the same time, though, I agree with you. I think we have a connection with wherever we're born with the earth. We have a connection with the physicality of it. That's part of it. It's not all, I'm not of the, the meat sack mentality that, oh, the body is just a bunch of bullshit. No, it's your friend. You need it, maybe not all of you is going back to the earth. Maybe not all of you is going to be returned to ash and dust at the end of it all, but there's a reason for it. And we have a symbiotic relationship with it. And, it's a beautiful thing.
That's an amazing place to end it. Solar, do you have any final words for Paul or final questions?
No, just gratitude for coming on, man. This conversation was a blast. So yeah, I hope you've as much as I have, and I'm sure the listeners have as well. So thank you, man.
I've totally enjoyed it. I've had a lot of fun, and I think I agree with what you said at the very beginning of this. There's a story we've been all working on parallel lines, and this was a conversation that needed to happen, and so we've done it, and I hope we have another one sometime in the future.
You're welcome back anytime, Paul. I know that I won't have to bug Solar that much to come back on to co-host with me if you come on. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And obviously, this was a conversation that I long wanted to have, long awaited. And I feel like just being around people who exposure me to a more broader range of ideas has been really helpful to me. Not that I necessarily believe them, but that I do grow, I do expand in my consciousness at least, and in my perspective. So I have to say that it's been an incredible generative year. If you want to plug your socials, and I'll include everything in the show notes, links to your book, all of that. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Solar.
Oh yeah, no, I'm at Demonosophy or Paul Fredric on X, and Paul Fredric on YouTube, and Paul Fredric on TikTok, and that's about the extent of my social media these days.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll make sure. Yeah, sorry, Paul, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just gonna return, back at you. I much appreciate this conversation. It's been great, and hope we do it again sometime. And y'all keep the dark fires burning.
We'll try. It's a black flame universe, I guess.